She's never done anything for this family. The whispers sliced through the funeral home like a blade cutting silk, sharp enough to make my hands shake around the black prayer book. I stood there in my discount dress, watching 40 relatives in designer suits cluster around my mother's mahogany casket, their voices low but their judgment loud as thunder. The stained glass windows cast blue shadows across their faces, making them look like strangers I'd never wanted to know. My chest burned with humiliation so hot I could taste it. 43 years old, and they still saw me as the family failure standing in the back corner, the one who couldn't afford flowers expensive enough to matter. But they didn't know the truth about me, about what I'd really done for this family. And in 10 minutes, when that lawyer opened my mother's final letter, every single person in this room would fall silent in a way that would haunt them forever. And this is the story of how my family buried me alive at my own mother's funeral, and how I clawed my way back from the dead to destroy everything they thought they knew. My name is Olivia Chen. I'm 35 years old, and I'm standing in the back pew of St. Mary's Cathedral, like a ghost at my own mother's funeral. 3 rows from the exit, the seat of the invisible, the spot reserved for family members who don't quite count. The morning light filtered through those massive stained glass windows, casting rainbow shadows across a sea of black suits and designer dresses that probably cost more than my monthly rent. 200 people had come to pay their respects to Margaret Chen, beloved matriarch of the Chen dynasty, pillar of Boston's business community. And there I was, pressed against the back wall in a dress I'd bought at Target, watching my own blood treat me like a stranger who'd wandered in off the street. Father sat in the front row like a king holding court. Leonard Chen, granite jaw, silver hair slicked back with the kind of precision that screamed control. His eyes swept the crowd with the calculating gaze of a man who measured human worth in stock prices and quarterly reports. Even in grief, he radiated the authority that had built Chen Industries from a corner deli into a $50 million empire. Aunt Miriam perched beside him, her string of pearls so tight around her throat they looked like handcuffs. She'd flown in from Manhattan in her private jet, probably billing the flight as a business expense. Her Botoxed face remained frozen in an expression of practiced sorrow, but I caught her checking her Rolex twice during the opening hymn. My brother Ethan filled out his Armani suit like he was born to wear it. At 38, he was father's golden boy, the heir apparent who'd never made a wrong move in his perfectly curated life. His tie was knotted with mathematical precision, his smirk sharp enough to cut glass. He kept his arm around his wife Jennifer, both of them radiating that particular brand of superiority that comes from never having to worry about money. The cousins, David, Michael, Patricia, sat clustered together like beautiful sharks in Italian leather. Sleek hair, perfect makeup, eyes that calculated net worth faster than pocket calculators. They'd all followed the family blueprint. Ivy League degrees, strategic marriages, corner offices with views of Boston Harbor. And then there was Mom's portrait on the easel beside her casket. High school yearbook photo, probably from 1978, before she'd married into money and learned to hide her genuine smile behind pearls and politics. In that picture, she looked like she was holding back a secret, her eyes twinkling with something almost conspiratorial. Looking at that photo, I could almost hear her voice. You know, don't you, sweetheart? You know what they don't. But sitting there in that back pew, surrounded by relatives who'd spent 35 years treating me like an embarrassing footnote in the family history, all I knew was humiliation burning through my chest like acid. I'd left Chen Industries 3 years ago, not fired, pushed. The difference lives in the angle of a closing door, in the way security escorts you out while your own father refuses to meet your eyes. I'd been the director of operations, working 80-hour weeks, bleeding company blue, thinking I was building something permanent. Instead, I'd built my own exile. The whispers had started during the prelude. Soft murmurs floating back from the family section like poison in expensive perfume. Such a shame about Olivia. Still living in that tiny apartment in Somerville. Margaret always worried about her. Never could stick with anything long enough to succeed. Each word was a precision strike, designed to remind me exactly where I stood in the Chen hierarchy. At the bottom. Always at the bottom. Father had made that clear during our last conversation, 3 months ago at Mom's birthday dinner. I'd been trying to explain my new consulting business, how I was finally building something of my own, when he'd cut me off mid-sentence. Olivia, he'd said, his voice carrying that particular tone of disappointment I'd been hearing my whole life. When are you going to stop playing pretend and accept that some people are builders and others are maintenance? Maintenance. Like I was a janitor mopping up after more important people's messes. The service dragged on with the predictable rhythm of expensive grief. Eulogies from business partners who talked about Mom's charity work and social contributions. Readings from Shakespeare and Frost that made her sound like a saint instead of the complicated woman who'd raised me to believe I could be anything, then watched silently while her husband destroyed that belief piece by piece. I thought the worst they could do was ignore me. Pretend I didn't exist while they celebrated a version of my mother that felt as polished and artificial as everything else in their world. I was wrong. Because as the service ended and people began filing out for the reception, I heard Aunt Miriam's voice cut through the organ music like a scalpel. She's never done anything for this family. The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt my face flush hot, my hands shake around the funeral program. 200 pairs of eyes suddenly seemed focused on me, cataloging my cheap dress, my discount shoes, my obvious status as the family disappointment. But they had no idea what was coming. No idea that in 20 minutes, when we gathered for the reading of Mom's will, everything they thought they knew about our family was about to explode like a bomb in that pristine funeral home. The truth was about to surface, and it was going to destroy them all. The pallbearers moved like dancers in a choreography of grief, their black suits synchronized against the marble floor. 6 men, my father's business partners, cousins who'd inherited their importance, carrying my mother toward her final resting place with the practiced precision of people who attended funerals like board meetings. Incense drifted through the cathedral, like fog rolling off Boston Harbor, thick and cloying, mixing with the scent of 200 bouquets that probably cost more than I'd made last month. The organ chords climbed toward the vaulted ceiling, each note designed to lift spirits, to transcend earthly pain. It wasn't working. Because while the ritual promised elevation, the whispers kept dragging me down into the gutter of family shame. She never showed up when the company needed her most. The voice floated back from 3 rows ahead, Cousin Patricia, her manicured nails drumming against her Hermes bag like she was keeping time to my humiliation. Always the weak link in the chain. Uncle Richard this time, his words sharp enough to cut through the organ music. He'd never forgiven me for questioning his expense reports during that audit 3 years ago. Apparently $5,000 dinners weren't standard business practice, but what did I know? I was just maintenance. The priest, Father Mackenzie, who'd probably baptized half the business elite in this room, began reading Mom's virtues from a prepared statement. Devoted wife, charitable soul, pillar of the community. Each word perfectly polished, sanitized for public consumption. I counted them like lies, half-truths at best. My mother had been complex, contradictory, human in ways that could never fit on a single page of liturgical praise. She'd been the woman who donated thousands to children's hospitals while quietly cutting the cleaning staff's hours to save money. The wife who smiled at charity galas while crying in bathroom stalls when she thought no one was looking. The woman who'd sat with me at our kitchen table at 1 a.m. when I was 12, surrounded by receipts stacked like paper fortresses. Her coffee gone cold while she tried to balance books that never seemed to add up right. "Don't let them measure you with their ruler, sweetheart," she'd whispered. Her fingers ink-stained from hours of calculations. "Their numbers don't define your worth." But she'd let them measure me anyway. Saturday silent while Father carved me into smaller and smaller pieces until I was nothing but spare change scattered across the family ledger. A flash of movement caught my eye, Father's head tilting slightly in my direction, his gaze calculating the interest rate of disappointment. Even during his wife's funeral, Leonard Chen was running numbers, computing exactly how much shame I was costing the family reputation. His eyes swept over my off-the-rack dress, black crepe from Macy's clearance section, probably the same price as Aunt Miriam's funeral shoes. They noticed. They always noticed. In a family where appearance was currency, I was perpetually bankrupt. The whispers continued, growing bolder as the service stretched on. Remember when she stormed out of the office that day? Making a scene in front of clients. Margaret was so embarrassed. Each word was a scalpel, precise and surgical, designed to dissect what was left of my dignity. I felt my face burning, my throat closing like a fist. 200 people pretending to mourn while my own relatives performed a character assassination in real time. The final hymn began, Amazing Grace, and I watched my family's mouths move in practiced harmony. Voices that had spent the past hour shredding my reputation now lifted in perfect unison, as if cruelty and worship were just different movements in the same symphony. My lips stayed sealed. My throat was a locked door, bolted shut by 35 years of swallowing words I should have screamed. The melody washed over me like water over stone, beautiful and meaningless, while I stood there choking on unsaid truths. But in 20 minutes, when we gathered at the lawyer's office for the reading of the will, that locked door was about to explode off its hinges. Because what none of these people knew, what I'd kept hidden for 3 years while they called me a failure, a disappointment, a weak link, was that I'd been the one keeping their precious empire from crumbling. While they'd been playing politics and padding expense accounts, I'd been the one working 18-hour days, restructuring debt, negotiating with creditors, single-handedly preventing Chen Industries from becoming a bankruptcy statistic. And Mom had known. She'd seen every late-night email, every weekend sacrifice, every miracle I'd performed in the shadows while they took credit for the sunshine. The hymn ended, the silence stretched, and in that crystalline moment before chaos, I felt something shift inside my chest. Not grief, not shame, but something sharper. Something that tasted like justice. The pallbearers lifted the casket, the congregation rose, and I followed them all toward a reckoning that would rewrite every assumption they'd ever made about the family failure standing in the back row. They thought they were burying my mother today. They had no idea they were about to resurrect me. The law office felt like a tomb wrapped in mahogany and brass. Harold Halverson and Associates, 40 years of handling Boston's old money, their secrets locked behind oak panels that had witnessed more family destructions than a war correspondent. Heavy drapes blocked out the afternoon sun, leaving us in amber twilight broken only by a grandfather clock that ticked like a metronome counting down to Judgment Day. The sound was too loud, too insistent, marking each second like a heartbeat in an operating room. Halverson himself looked carved from the same wood as his furniture, gray suit pressed to mathematical precision, silver hair combed with the discipline of a man who'd never had a spontaneous thought. His briefcase sat open on the conference table like a mouth about to speak truths nobody wanted to hear. The brass clasp snapped shut with the finality of a gunshot. My relatives arranged themselves around that polished table like vultures circling fresh carrion. Champagne flutes appeared from somewhere, because grief, apparently, required proper hydration. The crystal caught the lamplight, throwing tiny rainbows across faces painted with faux sympathy and barely concealed greed. Father claimed the head of the table, naturally. Leonard Chen didn't just sit in chairs, he occupied them like territory. Ethan flanked his right side, Jennifer beside him, both of them radiating that particular smugness that comes from knowing you're about to inherit everything. Aunt Miriam had positioned herself for maximum dramatic impact, her pearls catching the light like armor. The cousins clustered together, eyes hungry as wolves, already calculating stock distributions and property values. I sat apart, always apart. The boardroom orphan in her discount dress, watching a family divide an empire I'd helped save while treating me like I'd contributed nothing but embarrassment. My pulse hammered against my collar like a muffled drum, each beat counting down the seconds until they discovered exactly how wrong they'd been about everything. Halverson cleared his throat with the authority of a judge calling court to session. We're here for the reading of Margaret Chen's last will and testament. The envelopes appeared like magic, heavy cream paper, red wax seals that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, legal documents bound in ribbon that looked expensive enough to be currency. My name sat on one envelope, slightly apart from the others. Even in death, Mom was making statements. The primary distribution, Halverson began, his voice carrying the practiced monotone of someone who delivered both fortunes and devastation with equal professionalism, follows traditional patterns established by Mrs. Chen during her lifetime. Eyes skimmed past me like I was furniture. Stock certificates rustled. Property deeds whispered promises of wealth. The Chen Industries shares, controlling interest, naturally, flowed toward Father and Ethan like gravity pulling water downhill. I watched my brother's face brighten with each bequest, watched Aunt Miriam's fingers tighten around her champagne flute as real estate holdings fell into her perfectly manicured hands, watched cousins exchange glances that calculated vacation homes and investment portfolios. The scraps they threw my way were insulting in their precision, enough to prove I hadn't been forgotten, not enough to suggest I mattered. A small trust fund, Mom's jewelry, The kind of inheritance reserved for distant relatives and disappointing children. Then Halverson paused, his fingers finding a second envelope sealed separately from the others. Heavier paper, deeper red wax. My mother's handwriting across the front in ink dark as dried blood. To be read aloud. No exceptions. The lawyer's eyes met mine for the first time since we'd entered this wood-paneled mausoleum. Something flickered behind his professional mask. Curiosity, maybe even respect. Mrs. Chen left specific instructions that this letter be read in its entirety to all present parties. He broke the seal with surgical precision. Unfolded paper that crackled like autumn leaves. And then my mother's voice filled that room like resurrection, speaking truth that had been buried for 3 years under layers of family mythology. 3 years ago, when Chen Industries faced bankruptcy, when creditors circled like sharks and our family name was 48 hours from becoming a cautionary tale in business journals, it was not your strategies that saved the corporation. Halverson's words hit the room like artillery shells. Champagne glasses froze halfway to shocked lips. The grandfather clock's ticking suddenly sounded loud as cannon fire. It was not your egos, your connections, or your inherited wisdom that pulled us back from the brink. Father's face had gone white as bone china. Ethan's mouth hung open like a broken door. Aunt Miriam's pearls seemed to be strangling her. It was Olivia, under her signature, with her collateral, at her risk, in her name alone. Silence detonated. A silver spoon slipped from Patricia's nerveless fingers, hitting her saucer with the crack of porcelain breaking. The sound echoed through the room like a gunshot in a library. Ethan's jaw went slack. All that practiced superiority drained out of his face like blood from a wound, leaving behind something pale and confused and desperately small. Father's whiskey glass, Macallan 25, probably worth more than my car, slipped from his fingers and shattered against the Persian rug. Amber liquid bled into threads that had probably witnessed a century of family secrets, but never one quite like this. For the first time all day, I could breathe. Air filled my lungs like victory, sweet and clean and tasting of justice that had been fermented in silence for 3 years. Every whispered insult, every dismissive glance, every moment they'd made me feel like I was nothing but a burden on the family ledger, all of it crumbling like a house built on lies. Because while they'd been playing games, I'd been saving their empire. And Mom had known. She'd seen everything, documented everything. And now, finally, everyone else would see it too. The truth was out, and it was beautiful. The silence stretched like a tightrope over an abyss, ready to snap under the weight of 35 years of lies finally colliding with truth. Then Father's voice cut through it like a blade dragged across stone. Fabrication. His hand slammed against the mahogany table, making crystal glasses jump. Margaret's gone. She can't be questioned. Anyone could have written this. The same Leonard Chen who'd built an empire on intimidation was trying to gaslight a room full of lawyers and witnesses. Desperation made him reckless, but I'd been preparing for this moment for 3 years. I reached into my purse, the same discount bag they'd all noticed, judged, dismissed, and pulled out a manila folder thick as a novel. My hands were steady as surgical instruments as I opened it, revealing documents that would incinerate every lie he'd ever told about me. "Check First Union filings," I said, my voice carrying a calm that burned like dry ice. Accounts ending in -1749 and -2213. Bridge loans signed at 2:17 a.m. On March 15th, while you were skiing powder in Aspen with your board buddies. I spread the papers across that polished table like dealing cards in a poker game where I held all the aces. Bank statements. Wire transfer confirmations. Board meeting minutes covered in my red ink. Each correction a small rebellion against a system designed to erase me. No executive bonuses until worker arrears cleared. I read from my own handwriting, 3 years old but fresh as blood. Payroll comes first. Always. Ethan's face had gone from pale to green, the color of someone watching their inheritance evaporate in real time. "You're lying. We would have known. You were in Cabo, celebrating your promotion to senior VP while I was negotiating with creditors at midnight. I pulled out email printouts, timestamps proving every word. Jennifer posted the beach photos on Instagram while I was restructuring our debt to keep 1,500 employees from losing their paychecks." Aunt Miriam leaned forward, her voice dripping with the poisoned honey she'd perfected over 6 decades of family politics. "Darling, we would have helped if you'd only asked." The audacity was breathtaking. I let my eyes lock onto hers, watching her squirm under the weight of her own hypocrisy. I did ask, during the emergency family meeting you called unnecessary drama. You told me to let the market correct me. Your exact words were, sometimes businesses need to die so stronger ones can be born. Her pearls seemed to tighten around her throat. The room was so quiet, I could hear the grandfather clock counting down the seconds until their world finished collapsing. Ethan made one last desperate grab for control, his voice cracking with the strain of a narrative that no longer fit reality. Even if this is true, you were just playing for leverage, gaming the system for personal gain. That's when something crystallized inside me. All those nights I'd stayed awake, all those weekends I'd sacrificed, all those moments I'd chosen other people's livelihoods over my own comfort, reduced to a power play by someone who'd never risked anything more valuable than his golf handicap. I wanted people paid on Friday, I said, each word sharp enough to cut glass. While you were calculating stock options, I was making sure Maria in accounting could pay her daughter's tuition. While you were networking at charity galas, I was restructuring loans so David in shipping wouldn't lose his house. Halverson cleared his throat, consulting his papers with the precision of a surgeon preparing for the final cut. There's an addendum to Mrs. Chen's letter. More papers rustled. More truth ready to detonate. Per the emergency restructuring agreement filed with the Massachusetts Secretary of State, the following conditions remain in effect. No executive bonuses until all employee arrears are cleared. Scholarship fund established for children of laid-off workers, funded by executive salary deferrals. And effective immediately, Olivia Chen assumes her permanent seat on the board of directors, non-negotiable and non-transferable. Father's mask didn't just crack. It shattered like safety glass, revealing something I'd never seen in his eyes before. Not rage, not disappointment. Fear. Pure, undiluted terror as mathematics collided with truth and came up wanting. He'd built his identity on being the patriarch, the builder, the man whose vision and wisdom had created the Chen dynasty. But the numbers didn't lie, and the numbers said his empire had been saved by the daughter he'd spent decades dismissing as worthless. I stood up, my chair scraping against hardwood like chalk on a blackboard. Everyone in that room, family, lawyers, the ghosts of 35 years of shame, watched as I walked around that table, my discount heels clicking against marble with the rhythm of inevitability. You didn't build this alone, I said, stopping directly in front of the man who taught me that love was conditional on performance, that worth was measured in quarterly earnings, that daughters were investments that rarely paid dividends. And you sure as hell won't bury me to keep it. The silence that followed wasn't just absence of sound. It was the death of everything they'd believed about power, about worth, about who deserved to sit at tables that determined the fate of empires. Father looked up at me from his chair, and for the first time in my life, Leonard Chen looked small. Not physically diminished, but existentially reduced, as if the very foundation of his reality had shifted and left him scrambling for purchase on ground that no longer recognized his authority. The board meeting is next Tuesday, I continued, my voice steady as granite. I'll be in the seat I earned 3 years ago. The seat I should have occupied while you all played house with money I helped save. I gathered my papers, my evidence, my proof of worth that had nothing to do with their approval and everything to do with choosing other people's welfare over my own comfort. Oh, and Dad? I paused at the door, looking back at a family that finally understood exactly who I was. Next time you want to humiliate someone at a funeral, make sure you know what they're capable of first. The door closed behind me with the finality of a coffin lid, sealing away 35 years of being small, being sorry, being invisible. I wasn't invisible anymore. The silence that followed my exit line spread through that oak-paneled room like spilled ink, staining everything it touched. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees, as if the truth had sucked all the warmth out of the air and left nothing but the cold mathematics of consequence. The grandfather clock kept ticking, indifferent to the family dynasty crumbling in real time around its steady rhythm. I turned back from the doorway, my hand still on the brass handle, watching 20 years of family hierarchy collapse like a house of cards in a hurricane. These people who'd spent my entire life making me feel small suddenly looked like children playing dress-up in suits that no longer fit. Before I leave, I said, my voice cutting through the silence like a scalpel through skin, let me be crystal clear about what happens next. I stepped back into the room, but I didn't sit down. Standing gave me the authority I'd never been allowed to claim, the physical presence of someone who'd finally learned that power isn't given, it's taken. I won't be your shield against federal investigators. I won't sanitize corruption or help you craft press releases that turn embezzlement into accounting irregularities. Father's face went through several shades of pale, settling on the gray of old newspaper. Olivia, you don't understand the complexities. I understand perfectly. I've been cleaning up your messes for 3 years while you took credit for the success and blamed me for the problems. I pulled out one final document from my folder, the compliance audit I'd completed 6 months ago, the one they'd buried because it was too inconvenient to acknowledge. But I will honor Mom's requests. I'll protect the workers you've been bleeding dry with delayed payments. I'll clean the books you've been cooking. And I'll stop the financial hemorrhaging you've been ignoring while padding your own accounts. The conditional offer came out like contract terms, because that's exactly what they were, non-negotiable conditions for a family relationship that had been purely transactional from day one. Father meets with the federal auditor Monday morning at 9, sharp. No delays, no lawyer games, no mysterious scheduling conflicts. His Adam's apple bobbed like he was swallowing poison. Good. It was about time he tasted what accountability felt like. You step back from the compensation committee immediately. No more voting yourself bonuses while rank-and-file employees work unpaid overtime. Olivia, that's not how. And Ethan loses all voting power on strategic decisions until the compliance audit is complete and every irregularity is corrected. My brother's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. His wife Jennifer had gone so pale her foundation looked like theatrical makeup painted over marble. These aren't requests. They're the terms of my continued involvement with this family business. Accept them, or find out what happens when the person who actually saved your company decides to tell the Wall Street Journal exactly how she did it. Father shrank into his chair, the physical manifestation of an empire builder who'd just discovered he'd been a middle manager all along. The man who'd terrorized my childhood with his disapproval looked like he was about to cry. Olivia, he whispered, his voice cracking like ancient leather, we're family. The words hung in the air between us, loaded with 35 years of manipulation disguised as obligation, blood as blackmail, DNA as debt collection. I looked at this man who'd shared genetics with me but had never shared kindness, never shared pride, never shared anything but criticism and conditional scraps of approval based on how well I performed for his comfort. DNA is biology, I said, each word precise, as a surgeon's cut. Family is behavior. And your behavior toward me has been anything but familial. The room held its breath. Even the grandfather clock seemed to pause between ticks, as if the universe itself was waiting to see what came next. That's when Halverson cleared his throat one final time, reaching into his briefcase for something small and glinting, a silver locket on a delicate chain, tarnished with age but still beautiful. Mrs. Chen left specific instructions that this be given to you personally, Miss Chen. He pressed the locket into my palm, and it felt warm, as if it had been waiting in my mother's jewelry box for 35 years, holding on to her body heat until this exact moment. The clasp opened with a tiny click that sounded loud as thunder in that silent room. Inside was a photograph of me at 12 years old, gap-toothed and grinning, wearing a crooked blue ribbon from some long-forgotten school achievement. My hair was a mess, my dress was wrinkled, but my smile was pure joy. The kind of unguarded happiness that comes before you learn that love has conditions. Tucked behind the photo was a piece of paper folded so small it was barely larger than a postage stamp. My hands trembled as I unfolded it, revealing my mother's handwriting in ink faded to the color of dried tears. You see around corners, sweetheart. You always have. Don't let them convince you to look straight ahead like everyone else. The world needs people who can see what's coming before it arrives. I love you. Always. Mom. The words hit me like a physical force, 35 years of feeling invisible suddenly rewritten by a woman who'd been watching all along, who'd seen my worth even when I couldn't see it myself. I looked up at this room full of people who'd spent decades trying to shrink me down to their size, trying to convince me that their narrow vision was the only way to see the world. But I'd always seen around corners. I'd seen the bankruptcy coming before they did. I'd seen the solutions they missed. I'd seen through their lies, their excuses, their attempts to make me believe I was the problem. And now, finally, I could see my future. A future where their opinions of me mattered less than my opinion of myself. I closed the locket, feeling my mother's love settle around my neck like armor. "The board meeting is Tuesday," I said, my voice steady as bedrock. "I'll be there," in the seat I earned, with the voice they tried to silence. I walked toward the door one final time, my inheritance secured not in stocks or property, but in the knowledge that I'd always been exactly who I was supposed to be. The girl who could see around corners had finally learned to trust her own vision. I pushed through the heavy oak doors of Halverson and Associates and stepped into an October evening that felt like stepping into a new life. The air outside was sharp and alive, cutting through the stale atmosphere of 35 years of family suffocation like a blade through silk. Boston at dusk was painted in shades of amber and gold, streetlights flickering on like stars being born. Leaves scattered across the sidewalk like coins thrown by a generous universe, each one catching the light as it danced in the wind. The sound of my heels on concrete had changed, no longer the tentative steps of someone apologizing for existing, but the steady rhythm of someone who knew exactly where she was going. My phone buzzed against my hip. Text message from Maria in accounting, the same Maria whose daughter's tuition I'd worried about during those midnight restructuring sessions 3 years ago. "Miss Chen, payroll cleared early today. Health insurance extended for all employees through next quarter. Whatever you did in that meeting, thank you. You saved us again." Another buzz. David from shipping. "Olivia, just heard about the compliance changes. My mortgage payment's safe. Kids get to stay in their school. You're a hero. 3 years of working in shadows, of sacrificing credit for the sake of keeping people employed, of choosing other people's stability over my own recognition, finally bearing fruit in messages that mattered more than any board resolution." The gears I'd set in motion during that confrontation were already turning. The clauses I'd buried in legal documents like landmines were detonating in sequence, reshaping the landscape of a company that had forgotten who'd actually saved it. I paused at the corner where Commonwealth Avenue met Arlington Street, the public garden stretching out before me like a promise. The swan boats were gone for the season, but the pond reflected streetlights like scattered diamonds, each one a possibility I'd never allowed myself to consider. Behind me, the law office windows glowed yellow against the darkening sky, squares of light where my family was probably still sitting in stunned silence, trying to reconcile 35 years of assumptions with 10 minutes of documentation that proved them catastrophically wrong. I could picture them in that oak-paneled room, Father staring at papers that revealed how little he actually knew about his own company, Ethan realizing that his golden boy status had been built on someone else's foundation, Aunt Miriam calculating how much this revelation would cost her in country club credibility. But I wasn't looking back anymore. The truth my mother had left me wasn't just vindication, it was a shovel for digging out of graves they'd tried to bury me in. It was a map showing roads I'd been told didn't exist. It was a key to doors they'd convinced me were locked forever. At my mother's funeral, they'd tried to bury me in ground they thought they owned, tried to inter my worth alongside her body, to make my contributions as invisible as bones in a casket 6 feet under. But dead things don't fight back. Dead things don't produce documents. Dead things don't walk into law offices with manila folders full of evidence that resurrect truth from 3 years of carefully constructed lies. I wasn't dead. I'd never been dead. I'd just been sleeping, waiting for the right moment to remind everyone that some stories don't end with the villain's victory. The evening air carried sounds of the city coming alive around me, car horns and sirens, and the distant rumble of the Green Line carrying people toward futures they couldn't yet imagine. Somewhere in that symphony was the sound of my own life finally beginning, 35 years late but right on time. I touched the locket at my throat, feeling the weight of my mother's love settle around me like armor forged from truth and tempered injustice. The 12-year-old girl in that photograph, gap-toothed and grinning, wearing that crooked blue ribbon, had grown into exactly who she was supposed to become. Someone who could see around corners, someone who could save companies while staying invisible, someone who could endure decades of dismissal and emerge stronger, not bitter. Someone who understood that revenge isn't about destroying your enemies, it's about building yourself into someone they can never tear down again. My phone rang, unknown number, but I answered anyway, because women who save corporations don't run from phone calls. "Miss Chen? This is Rebecca Walsh from the Boston Globe. We're working on a story about corporate restructuring and ethical leadership. We'd love to talk to you about your work with Chen Industries." I smiled, watching my reflection in a storefront window, No longer the pale, tired woman from this morning's funeral, but someone who looked like she could handle whatever came next. I'd be happy to talk, I said, but, fair warning, it's quite a story. Behind me, church bells began to toll across the common. Not the mournful funeral bells from this morning, but something different. Something that sounded like celebration, like vindication, like the universe finally exhaling after holding its breath for 35 years. The bells weren't marking an ending. They were announcing a beginning. I walked forward into the streetlight glow, leaving behind the girl who'd hidden in back pews and stepped into the life of a woman who'd claimed her seat at the table she'd saved. The truth had set me free. And freedom, I was discovering, looked exactly like justice served at room temperature with a side of documentation. Olivia's story isn't just about corporate drama or family betrayal. It's about the moment you realize that your value doesn't depend on other people's recognition. It's about understanding that some bridges need to be burned so you can build better roads. And if this story hit you right in the chest, if it reminded you of your own family dynamics or workplace battles, hit that like button and subscribe. Turn on notifications, because next week we're diving into another story about hidden strength and unexpected victories. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that being the family disappointment sometimes just means you're the only one with enough courage to tell the truth. Remember, blood doesn't make you family. Love does. Respect does. And sometimes the family that raises you isn't the family that deserves you. Until next time, keep your documentation close and your boundaries closer.